Hello, I'm Donna Williams and welcome to the third installment of the book Nobody Nowhere. My mother had retreated into a world of her own, but unlike mine, it held no safety for her. Her only salvation, her only friend, was my older brother. It was a war in which I was to fight alone, and they took a side together, and together they would gang up. I was a nut, a retard. I was a spastic. I threw mentals, and I couldn't act normal. Look at her, they would say to a child who to them was either a retard when I was in my own world or I was a nut when I was in theirs. I couldn't win. Looking at it from their point of view, I guess that they couldn't win either. My brother had probably woken up to the fact that I hardly acknowledged or accepted him, and my mother had long since been robbed of a life and the pride that she so badly needed and had been lacking long before I ever came along. She became the tormented single mother, and he became the all-important, the too-important only child. And their accusations flew at me, and so too did accusations fly at them from everyone else. People were saying that she had caused me to be so withdrawn by her coldness and her violence, and she probably believed this, and I let her. Had I ever wanted to reach out as myself to that intrusive outside world, I'm sure that she would have inhibited me. And yet even battered children form attachments to such a parent. I never did. If I had wanted a war in the first place, I guess I won it. Though she was a social cripple before I was even born, I accept my share of the responsibility for making her one even more so, and for robbing both her and my brother of a freer, more independent relationship with each other, which resulted in his rejection of her all these years later. When my mother and father fought alternately for him keeping me at home and her putting me in an institution, they must have each had their own conception of the future, and each of them was right. I became my mother's hell, and I became a rewarding experience for him. My mother had one reward, though. I was her little dancing doll. I was Dolly, the doll she never had. When I was 3, my mother took me to my first dancing lesson. I walked on tiptoe, I loved classical music, and I'd make up dances by myself, for myself. And this was taken as an indication that I do well at ballet. I loved the pretty things, and I accepted the ribbons and the netting and the sequins, and wearing them made them part of me, so I had no objections. Other people wanting to take part of this from me and to share it was another matter altogether. I remember the low cyclone fencing that was outside of the weatherboard hall in which I was to give one of my first and last performances for a long time. I remember the dirt path which had worn down in the middle of the grass strip that we were walking along. It was probably a driveway, but this was how I saw things, bit by bit, a string of pieces strung together. We went up a few steps and through double wooden doors. I was captured by the room, by the wood and the smoothness of the floor. My mother was probably fantasizing about how much she had longed to be in my shoes when she was a child. My mother was the second of 9 children, and she was the second daughter. Her family were poor bush people, and instead of distributing what little extras they got among all the children, the eldest daughter seemed to get it all. The Salvation Army had entertained the others, whilst the eldest daughter had got dolls, pretty clothes, dancing lessons. And my mother, being the second child, had watched in hate and in awe. She gave up competing. Instead, she tried for the role of the eldest boy, and she'd won it. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't glamorous, it built little sense of self-worth for her, but it gave her a position, and it was handy for getting satisfaction from violently thumping into her older sister and the friends she never made. Her sister, however, thrived on the attention she got, becoming charismatic and a charmer. And ultimately, that sister paid in guilt and shame, reaching out for forgiveness from her younger sister, my mother, who meted this with the same amount of mercy that she got from me. None. It seemed that there were children everywhere. Pink arms and legs were protruding from these torsos that were clad in Willoughby dancing school black leotards. The rowdy rabble began to subside, and the sharpness of the instructor's voice broke through. And the children created lines. We'd all become this big square of horizontal parallel lines. Eyes to the front. No, you, move over there. Not to the right, left. Look, you stand here. Helpful, invasive arms instructing and interfering, and me looking at my feet. The walls were going up. And the music was a blur. There was too much turmoil going on around me, invading my space, invading my mind. So with clenched fists I stamped my foot and spat several times upon the floor. "Take her out of here, Mrs. Williams," said Mr. Willoughby, the teacher. "I'm afraid she's not ready yet. Bring her back in a couple of years." Ashamed, my mother's dreams and hopes had exploded in her face. I was looking at the floor. My arm was being tugged violently. I was looking up, words pouring out of her mouth, and the tone was deadly. "That's it. You're going to a home." The hysterics went on in my head and probably spewed forth into the car. I wasn't aware. Willie never made it as a ballerina. My mother began to see me not as herself anymore, but as her spoiled older sister. So I became Marion, and as if to stress the hatred, this became maggots. And over the years, I became maggots. I see that girl in the mirror looking back at me. I see her thinking I'm crazy for believing I'm free. And yet I can see it in her eyes, that as I'm staring, she's trying to understand that I'm not lying. I'm just trying to find my way back home to me. There was a park at the end of the street, and there were roses on the way. There were houses, and every one of them had a special name. And the house on the end was the Rose House. I'd leave the house in the early dawn and I'd go exploring. I'd watch the fish in Mr. Smith's fish pond, and I'd peer through the glass doors at the back of the house at the back of the Rose Lady's house. I'd dance in their gardens and sing songs and recite the poems that I'd picked up. I'd eat Lena's mother's pot plants, and I'd throw the Rose Lady's rose petals high into the air and then walk through them as though they were the stars around my bed. Well, perhaps I was an angel to watch, but I was a devil to try to be with. The Rose Lady never told me off for the roses, and someone once commented on my singing, and then I stopped singing in front of people, although I didn't realize for years that they could still hear me, even if I couldn't see them.